We will begin with the first principle of democratic deliberation, and Dan.
Well, thanks. I've been a fan of democratic deliberation and a proponent of its applicability to bioethics for quite some time. So it's sort of lucky me that I got to work on a commission which is chaired by one of the leading lights in the field, Dr. Gutman. I think it's important as a way to engage contentious issues, asking for public deliberation and engagement by wide sectors of the public, more than just the powerful, more than just interest groups, and particularly for something like synthetic biology or any topic in biotechnology. Part of the reason it's important to engage the public is that, in fact, an issue like this affects everybody in the long run. Quoting from our report, at the core of deliberative democracy is an ongoing public exchange of ideas, particularly regarding many topics in science and elsewhere, in which competing views are advocated, often passionately. It's the process of democratic deliberation is guided by principles of reciprocity and respect, of publicity, transparency, and of accountability for those who make the decisions. In some ways, this is, of all the principles we have, more a process than a content principle. Obviously, there's some content that informs the process, but in the end, for our purposes, it's probably more of a process for engaging in questions like this. And I think we've tried as a commission to sort of live that out in what we've done so far about synthetic biology. We sought out input from scientists and, we can tell Tom Murray, engineers as well, who spoke to us. People who are both in the scientific community inside synthetic biology and outside synthetic biology, voices from business, from ecology, those who poll the public on their general ideas about a topic like this, from people who oppose synthetic biology on various grounds, and those who are wildly enthusiastic. A wide variety of religious and philosophical points of view. And we also read fairly widely in the very thick books we were given about the topic, and we sought public comment. And since in some ways the medium is the message, I'll go to reading the recommendation, which is that we encourage religious, secular, and civil society groups to maintain an ongoing exchange regarding their views on synthetic biology and related emerging technologies, sharing their perspectives with the public and with policymakers. Scientists and policymakers, in turn, should respectfully take account all perspectives relevant to synthetic biology. You may want to say that's motherhood and apple pie, but I think that in many ways it's critical that it be stated and stated clearly, and critical that the process continue. Our deliberations should not exhaust public debate about synthetic biology or any other aspect of biotechnology, and public engagement should continue. The science is developing. What seems innocuous to the views of some now may later not be. And we need to hear about that if there are significant developments and significant objections to those views later. And just as we had said before yesterday that responsible stewardship demands an iterative evaluation of the risks and benefits, so I think that deliberative democracy is ongoing and iterative. And so I think that this recommendation is actually quite important.
Thank you, Dan. For the next recommendation, John Aris.
Thank you. So within the context of this section on democratic deliberation, we have nested a a very apt case study dealing with what are often called intrinsic or intrinsically moral objections to synthetic biology. I'm going to start by reading our recommendation and then comment on it. So the recommendation reads, intrinsic objections to synthetic biology are best addressed when carefully described and evaluated both logically and in light of the best available knowledge about the state of the science and its capabilities. These discussions should be revisited periodically in light of future scientific and technological advances and novel research directions. I think that this is a good case study for any process of democratic deliberation. And I think that this particular recommendation is totally unobjectionable. I do, however, have some reservations about the way in which our report has so far dealt with these intrinsic objections, and I wanted to share those concerns with my fellow commissioners as well as the public. Now, by intrinsic objections, we mean a loosely connected set of worries about synbio that refer either to the crossing of morally salient boundaries here and now. For example, we hear claims about playing God or creating life, substituting the manufacture of artificial organisms for the processes of evolution, and so on. Or to threats of undermining, over the longer term, our understanding of and relationship to nature and the environment. And that's a theme that is played out in some of the environmental literature that we've been looking at. Now, many reports and papers on synthetic biology that belong to the same genre as our project often divide up the worries or objections to this emerging technology into separate discussions of, first, risks and benefits, namely the terrain covered, I think, very well by our principle of prudent vigilance, and secondly, this catch-all collection of so-called intrinsic objections. It's not a very good name for it, but I'll just use it as a term of art. So my question for the Commission is this: have we done justice to these so-called intrinsic worries in our working draft? Now, compared to our minutely detailed sections on risk assessment and oversight, I think it's fair to say that these intrinsic objections get relatively short shrift so far in our report, although I think we are making progress on this front over the last couple of drafts. We conclude that, quote, we are not persuaded by concerns that synthetic biology fails to respect the proper relationship between humans and nature, end quote. But at least as I read our work so far, we don't really explain in any detail exactly why we reached this conclusion. So there are two ways of looking at this question that yield very different answers, corresponding to two different conceptions of the function of such reports. First of all, one could take a bottom-line approach. And here, the question that we pose in our report is the following, and this is a really important question. The question relevant to our present review of synthetic biology is whether this field brings unique concerns that are so novel or serious that special restrictions are warranted at this time. Now, I think that we all agree that the answer to this question is no. We don't believe that such special restrictions are warranted at this time. So, one perfectly reasonable conclusion would be to focus, as we've done, on questions of risk and oversight, giving these intrinsic objections a respectful mention, as we do here, but little more. The worry here is that, by concentrating on these so-called intrinsic objections, we would complicate the policy narrative with too much philosophy. Now, there's an alternative approach. Presidential Commission reports as state-of-the-art repositories of important or influential arguments intended not only to give policy guidance, but also to help educate the nation about the moral dimensions of key public debates. And I think, for me, the best example of this is from the original Presidential Commission back in 1983, in a report on foregoing life-sustaining treatment. This commission devoted an entire chapter to a cluster of influential distinctions, ways of speaking about foregoing treatments. For example, between omissions and commissions, or between ordinary and extraordinary treatment, that were quite common in the literature and the way people talked about these things. And these were distinctions that the Commission considered to be both partially illuminating, but also partially confused, unhelpful, and misleading. This chapter turned out, in my opinion, to be one of the best of many good things that initial commission accomplished. Their report was both a very helpful guide to future policy in the death and dying area, but also an invaluable educational resource for all of us in what was then a relatively new field. It gave us a state-of-the-art discussion that all of us, students, professors, journalists, judges, doctors, lawyers, and members of the public could draw upon as we entered those momentous debates. This alternative understanding of the function of commission reports would have us expand our discussion of internal objections to synthetic bio and move it some distance from the margins of our report to a more prominent place, perhaps to its own short chapter. And I hasten to add that I say this as a philosopher who is not personally persuaded by these intrinsic arguments, insofar as I've recently come to be acquainted with some of them, but who nevertheless thinks that they deserve a more robust treatment and detailed critical response than we afford them here. Thank you.
Next is Dan. Back to Dan for the next recommendation.
This follows on John's, but at least in some ways will differ as well. But it's talking more about the language that's used in public deliberations about contentious issues like this. Because I think we all recognize that the irresponsible use of language can distort public opinions, obscure the truth, and suppress or even poison public debate. We have no better recent example, I think, than the use of the phrase death panels in discourse about health reform. Democratic deliberation, I think, seeks a reasoned public debate in which the public is educated as well as engaged. So sometimes this language engages people, but I'm not sure that it actually serves the purpose of educating. Euphemisms that either linguistically soften reality or sensationalisms that linguistically amplify reality are equally, I think, to be avoided in a good public debate. This is especially true, I think, regarding scientific developments of which the public may have really very little initial understanding at the outset of a societal evaluation and discussion. For the press, as well as for interest groups, there are temptations, of course. Not only can these linguistic distortions serve to get your way, for the press, there are pressures, of course, to sell newspapers and advertisements. But there's also another difficult line to walk, and that's in the use of metaphor. It's often useful to use metaphors to simplify complex ideas in order to educate people, but sometimes these metaphors can seriously distort popular perceptions at the same time. So synthetic biology is exactly the kind of topic that's ripe for this kind of linguistic abuse. Scientists can use metaphors about nucleic acid sequences that, for instance, often draw on computer terms. DNA is the source code, and we're going to boot up an organism. Well, maybe that helps to educate people at some level, but it has adverse effects, attributing to the scientists greater power than they actually have, and of suddenly frightening people into thinking that they might be subjects eventually that will be booted up. And we've got to be careful about those things. News media can report that scientists have, quote, created life in a test tube. And then when the dust settles, we find that this really means that an obligate intracellular parasitical bacterium has been transspeciated using a synthetic chromosome that was made using the code of another species of the same genus. Right? The sensationalist description causes needless fear and anxiety. Phrases, and again here maybe a little bit of a difference with John, phrases like playing God turn out to actually be used much more by the media and by secular commentators than by the scholars and religious leaders of the world's great religions, who are, to be sure, anxious to warn us against the constant temptation we have to hubris. And I think that's maybe what's behind some of this. But they continue, nonetheless, to recognize that the sovereignty of their deity is not threatened by the ingenuity of a scientist. And so with that in mind, our next recommendation is that when discussing synthetic biology, deliberative forums should strive to offer clear and accurate language. The use of sensationalist buzzwords and phrases such as, quote, creating life or, quote, playing God may initially increase attention to the underlying science and its implications for society, but ultimately such words impede ongoing understanding of both the scientific and the ethical issues at the core of public debates on these topics.
Great. Thank you. Next recommendation, Steve.
Thank you. For all of us, meaningful participation in deliberations involving synthetic biology or any other emerging technology obviously requires useful levels of familiarity with concepts in science and particular aspects of the developing field. And we have spent quite a bit of time thinking about promotion of scientific literacy. There's a wonderful definition by the National Academy of Sciences of scientific literacy, which they describe as the knowledge and understanding of scientific concepts and processes required for personal decision-making, participation in civic and cultural affairs, and economic productivity. And I think scientific literacy involves really two related skills. It is understanding both the general nature of scientific advances as well as its implication, and the ability to formulate reasonable ideas about its appropriate use in specific situations. For example, in genetics and personalized medicine, an area that is high on many people's list of important emerging technologies. Not only understanding how variants in our genetic structure are identified is important, but having some level of comfort with the mathematical concepts that are needed to interpret these results is equally important. Ideas such as sensitivity, how do you know whether this finding will predict an outcome? And specificity, how do you interpret the people who may be many people who will have the change that you can measure but not develop the outcome of interest. So concepts such as this are critical for interpreting scientific information. Making science accessible to the public requires creativity and innovation. We spoke yesterday about the importance of making ethics important to scientists and making that an interesting part of our education. And similarly, we need to find better ways to make science interesting to the general public. A few years back, I had the pleasure to accompany a friend who was awarded the Nobel Prize. And what was so impressive to me about that trip to Stockholm is that during the week when the Nobel Prizes are given, the entire nation is transfixed on science. People are stopped in the streets, and we're asked, which party are you with? Oh, I know that discovery. Television is full of discussions about the nature of these prizes, and it would be just wonderful if a similar period in time could be developed in the United States, where we were equally interested as a community in scientific discovery. So public education efforts are clearly central. It needs to be made as exciting, as important, and as relevant to our present and our future as the science itself. So our next recommendation is as follows. Educational activities related to synthetic biology should be expanded and directed to diverse populations of students at all levels, civil society organizations, communities, and other groups. These activities are best encouraged and supported not only by public sources, but also by private foundations and grassroots scientific and civil organizations and civic organizations. The EOP, through an interagency process and with input from the scientific community, the public, relevant federal agencies, and private organizations, should identify strategies to promote scientific and ethical literacy. This group should consider the feasibility of including public education modules in research funding agreements, either linked to specific projects or organized at the institutional level among recipients of federal research support. The results of this review should be made public.
Thank you. We added one recommendation to these, not as a separate recommendation, but as an addendum in a discussion that we had most recently. And it reads as follows, and then I'll do a brief explanation of it. To further promote public education and discourse, we recommend that an online mechanism be created, ideally overseen by a private organization, to fact-check the variety of claims relevant to advances in synthetic biology and other biotechnological innovations. What we have in mind is the bioscience analogy to factcheck.org. So, if you will, biofactcheck.org, which would be run by a nonprofit, nonpartisan group. And like factcheck.org, it would be the go-to place when there were new innovations that came out with claims flying, whether by the innovators themselves or by the media or by critics of them, which even the educated public really, and even journalists who are covering this, really don't have at their fingertips whether these claims are factual. You could go to an online resource and check it out, the same way you can in politics with factcheck.org. And so we're recommending, and I'll just repeat it, to further promote public education and discourse, an online mechanism ideally overseen by a private organization to fact-check the variety of claims relevant to advances in synthetic biology and other new advances in the field of biology and technology. To give one example of how that might have worked in this case, the phrase that the Wilson Center and others who have done reviews of the publicity that came out after the Venter Institute announcement was made, the phrase that was most used was creating life. If there were the biofactcheck.equivalent of factcheck.org, you could have gone online and simply found out that what the Venter Institute did was not to create life. The life of the cell, there was a living cell in which the genome was injected and the genome self-replicated, and therefore the cell was taken over by a new genome. But the life existed prior to that experiment. Venter Institute itself did not say anything to the contrary, although as the rhetoric escalated, the notion of creating life took over. So, that said, I will open it up to any commission members for comments and questions about these recommendations under democratic deliberation, and anybody in the public who wishes to make a comment or a question, please just stand up behind the mic and I will recognize you. Who would like to begin? Dan.
I'd like to respond a little bit to John Aris because I'm sort of two minds on this, John. I recognize that it is important to acknowledge differing views, and I have a PhD in philosophy. I'd like to have a long section that sort of unpacks what's wrong with some of these kinds of arguments. But I think that against that, we've been given a fairly short turnaround time for this particular report. I don't think we actually have the kind of staff that was around in terms of PhDs in philosophy at the time of the president's, the previous president's commission that you were talking about, I think that also the kinds of arguments that they were making were against pretty prevalent views, and I do think that the kinds of intrinsic objections here, from what we've heard, are not very prevalent within the public. So I could make a long kind of argument about why it is that the playing God argument reduces to a claim that one is usurping prerogatives which ought to be reserved to God, which turns out to be kind of the elementary sin, because do not kill is also, for instance, usurping prerogatives that only belong to God, who's the Lord of life. So therefore, this reduces to only saying that it's wrong, and therefore you still have to give explanations for why that's the case. But I'm afraid that in the context of this kind of a report would be distracting, just as it would if we went into a very complex analysis of the concepts of risk that we were talking about yesterday and trying to get our handle on those as well. So it may be that we want to do supplementary work on these kinds of topics, which are very important, but I don't think that they fit well into this genre.
Anita?
Thank you. I have a lot of empathy for the kinds of remarks that John Aris was making about the intrinsic values section of our report. Just a couple of things. I think that the earlier report that you referenced was different from ours in that I believe it was addressing a very distinct kind of clinical practice or clinical issue. Is that right? That was. Yeah. Yes. And when you have a very distinct clinical practice issue on the table, I think you can do a much more refined, detailed philosophical analysis of the concepts and the issues at stake. I think because we're really talking about something much less formed at this point, that maybe our discussion of intrinsic value arguments is going to naturally be a little bit less refined. On the other hand, I do think that we could say more in the report about the ethical aspects of impact on biodiversity, ecosystems, food and energy supplies. We have a one-liner in our pending draft report that would say a lot more about why these things matter. Why do we care about biodiversity? Who cares if there are fewer forms of life, and some of them are man-made? What are these impacts on the ecosystem that we care about intrinsically as opposed to by virtue of consequentialist concerns? What are the food and energy supply implications, and why do they matter in an intrinsic manner as opposed to extrinsic manner? So that particular part, I agree, really needs to have a lot more said about it in our report.
Good. I think it's clear we will say more in our report. One of the challenges, I think, of doing this has nothing to do with whether we're philosophical or practical, because we really aim to be both. And it's as I've been on record as saying, and I think this commission illustrates, it's really a false dichotomy here. We want to bring good theoretical reasoning to bear on practical issues. But the challenge here for us has a lot to do with the fact, and it is a fact, that synthetic biology is in a very early stage of development. And right now, is the threat to biodiversity is, you have to project it way into the future at this point. And therefore, our discussion turns out to be more theoretical than so theoretical, because we don't have really any ability to know where synthetic biology is going, or whether it's even going in the direction at this point that will, in fact, produce this threat. That said, we have some discussion in our report, and I think I can speak for Jim and myself, and I'll let Jim speak for himself as well, but he and I just spoke moments before we convened and said, we want to give as robust a discussion in this report as is suitable to the topic, and we've moved in that direction. We'll have to move a little bit or substantially further. Whether it's a separate chapter, I think John, by your gesture, that's not really what's important. Right. We really just need to make sure that the issues. See, I think what I need is biodiversity is an issue which there is a significant link to synthetic biology. Unlike what Dan said, and I think you'll also agree, the charge of playing God has no hook in synthetic biology at this point. And everybody we consulted with, and we really did not only consult bringing people here, but we got lots of letters. There's no major religious constituency that said they were fearful of the playing God with regard to synthetic biology at this point. So, yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, just to say, except as we were saying, and as I think John said and I did as well, the caution against hubris, which I think underlies that. And we maybe we need to amplify what we've said about that just a little bit within the text.
And one other thing which we say in the text, but we may also want to amplify. There was a sense among, and it wasn't really simply religious groups, and I think it wasn't mainly religious groups, it's just people who think, and you don't have to be religious to think life special, that the language of biobricks is a reductionist language if it's used other than to describe the fact that there are component parts that are being put together, but if it's used to characterize life itself, that life is a sum of a bunch of biobricks. And we've said something, we probably should say some more about that.
Nita, can I jump in since my name was invoked here?
Jim.
Two or 3 points.
I always recognize you after you put your light on.
I know you can see it. It's my claim to a slot. 2 or 3 points. I think start with specific and go to general. We should, when we talk about diversity, and we should perhaps talk a little more about biodiversity, we should take Tom Murray's caution to heart. We're talking about genetic diversity. Because within, again, way down the line, one can imagine, or even fear, if you will, manipulation of the human genome. And it would be diversity within the human genome that we would also want to preserve as well. So that's point one. Point two, I remind the Commission that the only objection that we heard, the only call that we heard for a moratorium on all activity in our prior presentations was not based on religious grounds. Okay, and I'll remind you of that, and it was fairly intransigent. I remember Nelson asking under what conditions would you raise the moratorium, and it seemed to be it was Armageddon or something. I can't recall, but it was way down the line. I do think, to John's point, it would be wrong if a reader of our report was left with the impression that we were not aware of these intrinsic concerns. It would be wrong if the reader imagined we did not take them into account to the extent that they're applicable. So to the degree that they could be listed, or and you can help, John, if there's ways that we could expand that in order that the reader is certain that when we come up with 19 or 20 recommendations, that these recommendations were based on a totality of information and we didn't just ignore as irrelevant some aspect. It would be, in fact, counter to our recommendation that says we encourage religious, secular, and civil society groups to maintain an ongoing exchange. And so, having said that, everything else that Amy just reflected, is reflective of our conversation earlier. I don't know as one needs an entire small chapter to do that, but I think it is important that the reader feel as though we touched every base when we came up with 20 recommendations.
Christine.
I was wondering if this is an area where we might emphasize a sort of concept like the prudent vigilance, because it is true that at the moment the concerns that we heard about and read about, we don't think are major concerns. But this is something that we do want to encourage people to continue to watch and look at and talk about and dialogue about. And so maybe that's the point that we want to strengthen, is the continued attention to these issues over time as the technologies change.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's very important. Nita.
Thank you all for an incredibly thoughtful discussion on this. I agree. I think that we need to flesh out the intrinsic concerns. I'm going to talk about a slightly different direction of these recommendations that I think we should focus on as well. We had incredibly helpful testimony yesterday from Tom Murray about thinking carefully about to whom our recommendations are directed, and also when our recommendations are suggesting. And the way that we currently have the chapter framed as well as the recommendations framed, I'm not sure we're making quite as clear as we should to whom we are directing the call for democratic deliberation. So I take it that we are making this call not just to a particular government agency or to the government, but it is a call to the public generally. But I think in order to make sure that that happens, there needs to be a clear leadership role as well. And so I would suggest that we make clear this is a call both to the government to potentially take a lead and to ensure that in any conversations going forward that the public is actively involved, but also to think also a call to the public and to scientists and to those working in the field to actively engage. So another area that I'm particularly interested in, which is biological predisposition evidence and how it's being used in law, I've sought to engage scientists in informing a lot of the legal debates that have happened, and they've shied away from doing so for fear of misrepresentation of the science. And I think that fear is one that should really be a catalyst for scientists and for others engaged in it to actually be engaged in the conversations and to ensure that they're shaping the debate going forward. Which brings me to that second concern, which is not just to whom but when this is happening. We are of great fortune to be dealing with an issue that is emerging. So synthetic biology is an incredibly new field. And we received significant public commentary on this point as well. So on the point of democratic deliberation, we had a very thoughtful commentary by Dan Kahan and Don Bremen at our first meeting, who also submitted some additional an additional letter as well as additional thoughtful research for us to consider, where they likewise make a call for public commentary and to think about shaping that debate by taking into account things like intrinsic concerns and making clear both where our positions are currently, but also to help frame that debate so that it isn't one that is framed by these catchphrases like playing God, etc. But they emphasize that these are not just ongoing conversations, but ones that really need to happen now while the field is still young. And so for scientists and for policymakers and for the public, the time to engage in that debate, the time to shape that debate is now and going forward rather than waiting before the field is already shaped with significant cultural terms and significant terms that color and shape public views. So I would suggest that we make clear we mean to whom and when these recommendations should apply. And then just on a side note, I am incredibly supportive of our new recommendation of having an online forum. And I had mentioned that there is a neuroscience one that has developed as well called Neuroskeptic, where a UK neuroscientist has been taking each of the major fMRI studies that come out and has been analyzing what those studies say and kind of debunking different myths and different applications of those types of science. And I admire that effort by that particular neuroscientist and think that a broader effort that could be funded by a large private organization or funded by a group of organizations and bring together more than just one scientist leading the charge would be a really terrific way to try to shape this debate.
Terrific. Let me just summarize some of the specific feedback from the Commission that I'm sure we're going to integrate into the report. We're going to give a more robust review of objections, not just intrinsic objections, I think, but the whole range of objections to synthetic biology. Two, we're going to call for deliberation now when the science is still young. Let me just say that this is, for the President's Commission, we have perhaps a historically unprecedented opportunity here. In the cases in the past, the cat was out of the bag. Dolly was already cloned when the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, NBAC, was called by President Clinton to issue a report. Synthetic biology, as I've said, is in infancy, maybe adolescence. So calling for deliberation now will make a difference in the public perception of science and this field. And third, I think it's really important to call for scientists as well as civil society associations, as well as the government, to be involved in this kind of deliberative effort. We heard from a group of scientists who are truly extraordinary in their ability to communicate publicly. One only had to listen to a Drew Endy speak about synthetic biology, and you sort of wanted to clone him, but I know that's ethically wrong. So that's just a joke for the record. But I think these are a good set of additional recommendations for how we should write the report.
May I offer a very, very quick amendment or suggestion for the consideration of the group? I was thinking about Steve's mention of the period in Sweden where there's such excitement about science. And I was also looking at these recommendations whole. It seems to me number 14, the first one that we heard, saying we want to encourage ongoing exchange, and number 17, Steve, the one about education. I'd like to suggest that we at least slip the word in there, and this is Nita's, coming off of Nita's comment about targets, something about the media and the Fourth Estate. Last time I can recall sort of maybe it's not the last time, a vivid period of scientific focus in this nation that I recall. One of those would have been around the earlier days of the space program. And I would think, and I think you would agree, that one of the key players in that was the media, was Walter Cronkite giving us language at the dinner table that, ablative heat shield and lunar excursion module language that wouldn't otherwise come to our tongue. I think encouraging, and I think there are a couple of foundations trying to do this as well, literate, open science reporting could be a good recommendation out of here. And simply by slipping the word media or journalism into the targets, I would like to suggest would be a good step.
Are there any comments or questions? Yes, perfectly timed.
April Dworetz, Emory. I have a question about emerging technologies, emerging behaviors, and was that discussed with the religious contingent and looking at some of the intrinsic concerns? Because I would imagine there might be more concerns with emerging behaviors than there would be with the rest of synthetic biology.
How about a quick example? You mean just what the unknown is? Is that?
No, there's a subset of synthetic biology that has to do with taking stem cells and putting them into a petri dish and letting them, hopefully, letting them emerge into organs on their own, so within their own cellular matrix, so that it's not actually taking them out of their own environment and hoping that they develop and form organs in vitro.
So the regenerative medicine dimension of synthetic biology is, I believe, is that the...
Yeah, that's...
I'm not sure if they're
I think that's probably where
same.
that fits. Thank you. I don't know. You want to comment?
Well, I think we heard, and it's too bad Raju isn't here because he's a very eloquent spokesperson for this, that there is a part in this part of synthetic biology which is very closely related to recombinant DNA and regenerative medicine. Indeed, we've recognized in the report that synthetic biology would be impossible. It would not have existed were it not for everything that was done with the mapping of the human genome and the really well-developed field now of genetic biology and molecular biology and genetic engineering. So this is a preface to saying that the issues that are attached to genetic engineering flow over into synthetic biology as it may develop. And all the synthetic biologists we heard from believe, as does the community of molecular biology, that there would be serious objections in their own mind, ethical objections, to extending this to the cloning of a human being or to changing human genetics in the way that wasn't directed towards addressing disease per se.
Okay, thank you.
And there are earlier President Commission's reports.
You say thank you, but I'm not sure. Did we cover what your concern was, or at least let you know that we have had conversation and thought about that?
Well, so I know at the MIT, Georgia Tech, and Illinois program that's working on synthetic, or the grant that funded synthetic biology has one subsection that's being done at Georgia Tech, which is basically defined as using the stem cells to form by themselves organ systems
on a substrate, yeah.
So that you're right.
Scaffold,
so that you're actually, so that it is developing into an organ system,
Right.
which is, and if you want to extend it out, you think about whether it eventually could develop into multiple organ systems and then into a human being.
Oh, I see.
So I'm wondering, now they're not close to that, they don't think that will ever happen, but at the same time, because people think that way, I did at least, when I first heard about it, I was wondering if some of the religious spokespeople thought about that or were concerned about that.
We did not hear that addressed directly as you pose it. In fact, most of the focus of our deliberation has been on the genetic side as opposed to the somatic side. Mm-hmm. But you make a very good point. All of the synthetic biology activity is principally around putting a genome in an existing chassis. You're talking about the issue of potentially generating a chassis which could ultimately evolve. while we didn't have direct discussion on that, I think we should let the group respond. I think the sense of the group is that the first issues to address are those around the genetic dimensions of synthetic biology, and that will those will be very germane if these other technologies, such as the ones you're talking about, which we feel, I think we believe, are even further in the future, obtain. Bear in mind that the kind of recommendations we're making are for essentially a living activity around guiding the ethics of synthetic biology. We do not, speaking of hubris, we do not imagine that this is the definitive work that will never need to be rewritten, but in fact the recommendations themselves call for continuing dialogue in order that we can address these sorts of issues as they might arise. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay,
Good.
thank you.
Good. I think we should move on to justice and fairness, and Christine.
So I want to start by recognizing, which Tom Murray reminded us yesterday, that any technological advance brings both the promise of benefits and possible risks. And we've seen and discussed the exciting potential of synthetic biology to address major challenges in global health and welfare, but also brings possible spectrum of risks to health, other species, ecosystems, national security, etc., and around the globe. As we've said, many of these risks are largely unknown, and even the promise of a benefit, and there's a need for careful and ongoing attention and risk assessment along the way. But in addition to the principles that we've already discussed in public beneficence, responsible stewardship, intellectual freedom and responsibility, and democratic deliberation, we as a commission want to also promote the fair distribution of the burdens and benefits of synthetic biology. So we have as one of our principles justice as fairness, and are committed to the sharing of burdens and benefits across society of this technology. This includes thinking about the distribution of burdens and benefits to people who work in laboratories and personnel who are associated with developing the technologies, as well as research subjects that might be involved in the studies that we do to develop the technologies and test them, and then the public once technologies are adopted, whether they're adopted intentionally or not. So for research subjects, there are mechanisms in place to assess risks and benefits before somebody is involved in a research study, and also requirements, regulations, that require research subjects be fully informed about what they're being asked to participate in. We wanted to look at whether or not the evaluation of research proposals for synthetic biology allows consideration of environmental exposures, social disruption, and other kinds of risks to groups or communities or future, the sort of long-term effects and impacts and consequences of the research on synthetic biology. And currently, the federal regulations instruct IRBs not to address these issues. In fact, the wording exactly is that under the regulations, both the Common Rule and the FDA regulations say IRBs, in the context of considering risks and benefits for research subjects, IRBs are instructed to look at risks in relation to risks to the research subjects in relation to benefits to the research subjects, if any, and the importance of the knowledge. They're also instructed only to consider the risks and benefits that may result from the research, and then they're instructed to not consider possible long-range effects of applying knowledge generated in the research as among the research risks that are under their purview. So given that, we thought in order to attend to the issues of fairness in the distribution of risks and benefits across society from synthetic biology research, that there needs to be some attention to this issue of thinking about the distribution of risks that affect more than just the individuals in the studies. And so with that in mind, the provisional recommendation is the Department of Health and Human Services, in conjunction with other relevant federal agencies, should evaluate different models and make recommendations to ensure that appropriate consideration is given to the distribution of risks, both short and long term, in research, and the development activities in synthetic biology. And then specifically, DHHS should re-examine existing regulations for the protection of human subjects found in the Common Rule and in the FDA regs to examine how they do or might guard against the possibility that risks are disproportionately borne by certain individuals or populations.
Excellent, thank you. We are now at the 19th and last provisional recommendation. Barbara.
Yes. This is a direct extension of what you just. Sorry. This is a direct extension of what you just heard in the last one, but what it does is extend that same thinking about risks in populations to the manufacture and the commercialization of products that would be developed from synthetic biology. So the real issue here is that they're underrepresented populations, cultures, economic status, nationality, political power, and things like that are often used to determine where testing will be done, what kinds of populations testing will be done on, and then even what kind of areas might be used to manufacture synthetic biology. So biology products. So I just mentioned some of the most egregious episodes in the past have had to do with just this very thing, with African Americans, with American Indians in Arizona, most recently with the finding of the study from Guatemala. So it has cultural aspects, it has population aspects, it has disadvantaged population aspects, and it has international aspects, particularly as it relates to underdeveloped or developing nations. So the 19th recommendation looks more broadly than at the manufacturing commercialization. And we want to be sure that there's protections and consideration of the risks, the long-term risks and the short-term risks of using particular populations, and that any population that is going to be considered, or any area, it could be a geographic area that's going to be considered. If you think about what synthetic biology products do, there are some that may be algae growing in giant lakes making biofuels, and where are those lakes going to be, and what are the risks to the communities in those areas? It might be a vaccine. It might be a vaccine for malaria or a treatment for malaria. That isn't going to be tested on people in the United States because that's not where the at-risk populations for malaria are. It's going to be tested in underdeveloped countries. So the real issue in this one is how you use the communities to actually help you design the activities, design the research activities, plan them, help even implement them, and be sure that they understand the risks and the potential benefits at the same time as you're doing this planning. I think that the community piece is very essential in all of this. So then there's also the issue of how you be sure that they get the benefits as well. Some of these things may be very expensive when they come out. You hope that a new drug for malaria will be cheaper than the old treatments for malaria, but say it turns out to be very expensive. These are the very populations that might not be able to afford it or might not have access to the kind of care that could be given in this regard. So I think there's a balancing then of being sure that the risks are understood, the populations are understood, and that the benefits happen for everybody, particularly the people that were most involved in the development. So with that in mind, the actual recommendation says manufacturers and others seeking to use synthetic biology for commercial activities, as well as those responsible for approving these efforts, should ensure that community and environmental risk evaluation shows that the most serious risks, including long-term impacts, are not disproportionately or unnecessarily borne by certain individuals or subgroups. The Executive Office of the President, as part of the review described in Recommendation 5, should consider developing guidance, materials, and voluntary recommendations in the absence of statutory change or regulatory requirements.
Thank you, Barbara. So that concludes the presentation of our recommendations, and I open it up to commission members for discussion. And again, if anyone in the public would like to make a comment or question, please stand up to the microphone. Nelson.
There's just one small comment, which is I think our recommendations, 18 and 19, don't reflect a lot of the comments that we just heard about also addressing the distribution of benefits. But there's language about distribution of bearing risk, but not about accepting or benefiting from the positive results of this work.
Correct, and we need to revise those. So there is a symmetry, actually, between risks and benefits here, which we have, for those keen observers of yesterday's recommendations, we have taken great care to indicate that the upside potential here is just as important to take into account as the downside risks. So if a malaria drug has the potential for saving lives, which it does, we want to make sure that those benefits are fairly distributed as well in and our recommendations take account of that. Dan? But these need to be reworded to take that into account.
Just in keeping with our general theme of regulatory parsimony, I have a worry that hadn't struck me until I just saw it now, that the second sentence in number 18 almost makes it suggest that seem that we're suggesting that IRBs be looking over bench work science to make sure that if somebody's working on a yeast in their laboratory, it doesn't get out and disproportionately affect brewers and bakers or something. So I think that we've got to be really careful that we're using. I think the intention is to use that analogously of those sorts of protections, but by putting that language in here and the numbers of the regs, it almost suggests that that's what we're doing. So I want to be very careful that we're not suggesting to scientists who are doing bench work that IRBs should now start reviewing their work. Yeah.
John.
Well, okay, so in light of that comment, I want to ask Christine, what are we in fact urging here? Because you're right that burdens to the public are explicitly ruled out of the common rule, whereas benefits to the public are explicitly ruled in. And I've always thought that to be a bizarre exclusion. This might be an opportunity to rethink that.
Well, that is correct, and I think it is problematic, especially when we start to think about group harms of various types from synthetic biology and other technologies. But I think there is a really interesting question here that Dan raised, and that is, who should review it? Should it be the IRB, or should there be some other mechanism to look at long-range consequences of research? And that's why I like the first sentence of the recommendation as it's currently worded, although it may have to be beefed up. And the second one I changed, you may have noticed, but I think we may want to change it, certainly from what it's currently worded, but maybe we might even want to strike it. I think the first part is absolutely critical, that the DHHS and other relevant federal agencies should evaluate different models and make recommendations to ensure that consideration is given to these long-term impacts. And people have been calling for that for a long time in other fields of science. So this, I think, is consistent.
Yeah, and that first sentence, I think, is precisely right. We're going to need to either strike or revise the second sentence, because we certainly don't intend to recommend that IRBs take over this task of overseeing the long-term benefits and risks of bench science. So we have to beware of the unintended consequences of your wording. And in this case, we will work on that. We'll initially strike it and see if we need anything more than the first sentence. And we may, in which case we'll get a better specification. Nita.
So I agree strongly with the sentiments of both of these recommendations. If I understand the sentiment to be as Christine is characterizing it, which is we don't wish to have any group disproportionately bear the risk without also realizing the benefits of that research. My only caution is it is the case, given some of the conditions that we'd be studying, like malaria, for example, that there are certain populations who will disproportionately bear the most serious risks. And so I guess I'm just pushing a little bit on the language that we're using. So I think the second part of number 19, where we say that it's not unnecessarily borne by certain individuals or subgroups, is absolutely right. That they are not disproportionately borne, I think, is perhaps just inaccurate. It is the case that some will bear it. What we are asking for is that it not unnecessarily be borne disproportionately by certain groups, and recognizing that certain groups may face the disproportionate risk. We want to ensure, particularly given that a lot of the medicines, as Barbara says, may become expensive or inaccessible to those very same populations, that they realize the benefits when they are subject to bearing the risk. So it's simply, I think, a matter of how we're wording this and understanding the realities of science such that we do so carefully.
Let me make a distinction here between the disproportionate bearing of risks by populations given the status quo, which exists, and no work on synthetic biology is going to change that, and the disproportionate risks borne through the activities of synthetic biology, and that we can recommend against.
We should, and maybe it's just my reading of this is unclear, but since I am a learned reader of our own recommendations, I would suggest that we perhaps clarify what we mean by the different risks, which is there is the disproportionate bearing of risk by the activities versus being the subjects or populations of research studies, both of which we believe need to be addressed, one of which is unfortunately harder to address. It's simply not, we're not able to say certain populations cannot be research populations, nor are we suggesting against it, simply that recognizing that certain populations will be research populations, we wish for those people to also receive the benefits of that research.
Yeah, although there are existing regulations which I, for one, strongly approve of and disapprove of the violations of it, which require human subjects research in clinical trials to make sure that when you're using people in clinical trials, they stand to gain, not to lose by the trials relative to the status quo. And we may need to say that here to remind people of that existing set of regulations, and those are very important. Are there any? Oh, Christine, did you want to say something?
I was just going to reemphasize that I agree with what you just said, Amy, about emphasizing the individuals in the research studies, but I think the missing link in research considerations is everybody else that might be affected by the research.
Yes. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning. Felix G., Chesapeake Research Review. I want to thank you for a very thoughtful discussion and lots of very thoughtful recommendations. I want to tie some of the discussions from yesterday back to some thoughts that have been put out today. And Dr. Salmaci, thank you for recalibrating the role of the IRB, because that's a perspective I want to speak to. And I want to speak from the perspective of a recovering Federal Advisory Committee member. I was on the Secretary's Advisory Committee since its inception, and served on various subcommittees and co-chaired a few, and have come off of it in 2007. So many of you know that SACHOP still exists and continues to work to advise Secretary of Health and Human Services on human subject protection issues. And one of the things that SACHOP has been wrestling with is the notion of helping the agencies come to terms and harmonize some of the interpretations in the regulations and the applications of those interpretations. And as I sit and listen to the thoughtful deliberation here, I wanted to ask the group to at least be mindful of the fact that having those agencies talk to each other are like herding flying cats. It's not just butterflies or cats. It's just a daunting task that has taken a long time for folks to try and do something. And yesterday, Dr. Murray thoughtfully reminded us that there ought to be clarity and consistency in the types of information that you give, especially to the agencies. I would add one other perspective to that. I would ask that you think about precision in terms of the types of recommendations that you make. Somebody, I'm not sure who it was, just recently recommended that there be better clarity on the types of things that you recommend to the agencies. And I would simply echo that, because in the absence of your specific recommendations, I fear that there will be a lapse in time that's going to be unforgiving. Research is going to continue, and the agencies are going to continue to deliberate. And I think we, as both the general population and the scientific population, will suffer from the agencies simply sort of discussing issues that you've put out, but without the precision that you've given them. They will make interpretations and fill that own void on their own, resulting in FDA asking IRBs to do certain things and OHRP asking the institutions to provide a level of oversight that you may not have intended.
That's a wonderful suggestion, and it provokes in me the thought that just as we were given 6 months to issue this report, we may want to suggest some time frame in which those specific recommendations should be addressed. That's yeah. Any other? We will take a break. We are a little past our time. We are scheduled to reconvene at 10:30. Let's say 10:35. Okay? Thank you.